Hello, my name is Denzel Stevens, and I'll be your host for this historical tour of the Oak Hill neighborhood. Sit back, relax, and let us take you on a historical journey, which all takes place in your neighborhood. We'll start our journey where most begin, or where most end. Here at the B&O station and banquet hall, you'll see it's still standing and very much still used today. However, before it became a banquet hall full of events and performances, it had to overcome many struggles throughout time to keep chugging along. It also saw its fair share of presidents. To find out more, we interview local historian Joseph Napier right here at BNO.
I'm Joseph Napier Sr. I'm a Youngstown resident. I was born originally in West Virginia. My mother brought me up here at a year of age. And this is my fair community. I've become an historian because I love the valley, I love the city I live in, and I enjoy telling stories and doing photography and videography as it applies to our history here in Youngstown. Yeah, the B&O Railroad, which of course stands for Baltimore and Ohio, is significant, first of all, because the folks that built the railway station saw Youngstown as a very important link in the whole map of the transportation system, if you will. Youngstown, back in 1926, when they built this facility, or when it was really up and running, of course it was built in 1905, but when it really got up and running with passenger traffic, this was a midpoint, if you will, between Baltimore itself and Youngstown and Washington, D.C., and Detroit, and Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. So Youngstown being centrally located as it played a major role. And I'm just happy that, I could tell the history about B&O Station. Yeah, the B&O in the beginning, of course, it was a passenger train station. We competed with three other stations in our fair community, of which all the other three were located downtown Youngstown. But the B&O train station itself was an important hub, as I mentioned, between Youngstown and Pittsburgh and Cleveland, in areas such as that. So when you look at the B&O station, first starting off as a passenger station, they got into freight, of course, and they made a lot of money there, so that came about as well. They actually built a freight house after the train station was built itself. And then it went on into where that train or passengers traffic started to wane somewhat, and they started to rely more on the freight traffic, getting goods around the country here and there. So that was a very significant role that it played as well. It went through the renovations in the early to mid 80s, and then it would ramp back up under the marker of Amtrak. And Amtrak would reestablish passenger traffic here too. It was limited, where it only took it to Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Chicago and areas like that. But nevertheless, and now of course it serves as a party center, an event center, and hosts weddings and parties all the time, and special events. Yeah, the flood in 1913 was very bad in that all the businesses in this whole area were flooded out. If you used to see old black and white photographs of the railway station, you would see that the water crested almost all the way to the rooftop. Following the flood of 1913, the tracks were elevated up to the second level of the building, matter of fact, and fearing another flood that would possibly could come again. As in our nations, or right here in Youngstown, the history of flooding happened two times in the city's history. Well, I tell them about the history of B&O, Baltimore, Ohio, the fact that it's there. It is located on the banks of the Mahoning River here, the southern banks of the Mahoning River. That it stood time. It lasted a great flood of 1913, for example. It persevered on through design changes with the railroad tracks itself that was pitched up to an elevation of about the second floor of the facility after the flood. And then it continued to go on. It received the extensive renovations. And it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And as we know then, it can't easily be torn down at all. In any efforts to renovate it, it has to be in keeping with the period and the date it was built, which was 1905. And it being here and located on the banks the way it is, it's a very aesthetically pleasing. And as the city was growing up around it, so to speak, there's a very important building in our community, a very important historical building. When you think of the 10 top structures in Youngstown, the B&O is one of them.
Many don't know this, but we have a rags to riches story right here in our very own neighborhood. Allow me to introduce you to George Renner Jr. This is a Youngstown icon who took over Old Sons & Co. Brewery at its lowest point and turned it into one of the most profitable breweries in Youngstown for its time. Renner Jr. was no stranger to the brewing business. Renner Sr., his father, runs a few successful breweries under his name in Mansfield and Akron, Ohio. Inspired by his father's success, he thought of operating a brewery in Harrisburg, PA. That is until an aristocratic train hiker told him of Old Sons & Co. encouraging him to become its sole proprietor. The brewery itself has a long history of ownership, which somehow led it back into the hands of one of its co-founders, John Bayer. Unfortunately, plans fell through on being able to sell the property on a profit, and John Bayer, having defaulted on his loans, sold it to John Smith's Sons & Co., who then sold it to George Renner Jr. for $4,800 around 1883, which would be worth roughly $130,000 today. However, owning this brewery was not without its struggles. Right off the bat in 1889, an exploding boiler led to a fire which ended up destroying the entire plant, which had by then already increased in value to $75,000. Rebuilding was difficult, but through hard work, good planning, and perseverance, the new brewery was built from scratch and opened in 1890, only a year later. With the new building built, all that stood in the way of their operations was the competition, until the Prohibition came along in 1919, making businesses incredibly hard for Renner Jr. and his brewery. However, they managed by producing a non-alcoholic beer called Renner and many other products such as ice and soft drinks. Due to the process involved in burning the alcohol out of the beer, Renner just wasn't as good as the real stuff. But they managed due to owning real estate for the saloons that served their beer. Eventually, Renner retired and his son took over the plant as chairman. Before his death, Renner Brewery's stock was valued at $600,000, an incredible bump up from his initial $4,800 investment, $61,800 if you include the cost of restoration following up the plant's explosion. His son would continue to keep running the brewery until 1962. As unfortunate as it was, being that Renner Brewery stayed open and operating for 72 years, they eventually had to close down. To this day, other companies that Renner owned as part of their merger with Forge Industries, such as Mill Spreader, Akron Gear Co., and Bearing Distributors, are still alive and well, and they are all overseen by the great-great-grandson of George Renner Jr., attorney Carl James. While the Oak Hill Cemetery is known and loved by all, there are still some qualities that not many know about. Oak Hill Cemetery is a historically rich site in the Oak Hill neighborhood dating back to the 1850s. Initially, people were buried at lots within the city, situated downtown on either side of Market Street at the corner of Wood Street. When these burial grounds became crowded and the sanctity of these sites were infringed upon, Youngstown residents decided it was time to make a change. These lots didn't feel like a respectful resting place for the dead. Many agreed that it was time for them to move somewhere deeper into the community. In 1852, concerned citizens formally got together to organize and become the Mahoney Cemetery Association. It was this organization that from 1853 through 1856, Dr. Henry Manny, who at the time was the owner of the land we see today, sold a total of 19 acres of land to the Mahoney Cemetery Association. It took a lot of hard work, but eventually they were able to not only move some of the buried from the overflowing grave sites dating back to 1811, but they also started a potter's field for the destitute of Youngstown. What this meant is that the citizens who died and could not afford a proper burial had a resting place. While this only lasted for 3 years, the concept was picked up again and put into place once more in 1924. To preserve the continuity of this old and important land, the Mahoney Cemetery Association started an endowment fund in 1922. Just over the course of 16 months, they raised more than $500,000 from families buying plots in advance. And since then, even more have purchased plots and paid into this endowment, continuing the legacy of Oak Hill Cemetery. Since starting this fund, Oak Hill Cemetery has been able to keep the cemetery open, build 6,000 yards of road and a 1,400-foot perimeter fence, and plant all beautiful foliage you'll find today. Oak Hill Cemetery is historically important, not just because it was over 25,000 people buried here, but because these 25,000 people contain a tangible record of Youngstown's history, from the humble beggar to unknown soldiers, to even Governor David Todd. A stroll through Oak Hill Cemetery will reveal years and years of history, almost lost to time.
Hello, my name is Pat Kerrigan. I am the founder and executive director of the Oak Hill Collaborative on Oak Hill Avenue on the south side of Youngstown. This documentary was designed to highlight some of the many cultural and historical institutions that were along Oak Hill and try to memorialize them before they're gone and memory of them is gone forever. This is a 2-mile stretch that runs from the Mahoning River all the way up to Indianola on the south side. We're trying to focus on 1 mile of that, on the lower mile of that, for a variety of reasons. First of all, because it's the older section of town, but it also had a lot of African American cultural type institutions here. Remember, we're on a hill, so it wasn't very good land to grow crops on, so the land was cheap. It flooded at the bottom through the Mahoning River, so that became an issue for some folks. We had a brewery, Renner Brewery was here. We had a hospital, we had a cemetery, we had institutions like that. We had railroads running through. So it wasn't the most desirable residential area, and people on the lower end of this economic scale tended to live here. So it has a lot of culture. The Buckeye Review was here, a couple of black bars and entertainment centers. One important one was Mac's Roller Arena, also known as Reed's Roller Arena. We'll have some discussion of that, but there isn't much left of that, even though it wasn't that long ago that went out of existence. But that was a truly institutional icon. It was the center not only of roller skating for an entertainment for many people on the lower south side, but it was an entertainment center in terms of rock and roll and music, soul music, jazz. It was a major stop on what they called the Chitlin circuit, so that groups would come through. They weren't allowed to perform in big institutions, say like at Stambaugh Auditorium or Powers Auditorium or places like that, but they could go to Reed's Arena and perform, and a lot of huge groups, James Brown was there. I mean, people would come that maybe the rest of the world didn't know about at the time, but it was good music, and they would go there, and then they would move on. Then maybe they go to Akron, maybe they go to Cleveland, they go to Mansfield, they go to some other place, and they just move on like that on this circuit. Well, it was a great institution in that respect, and unfortunately, it's gone. We don't have very much institutional memory of it. There's also was the brewery, Renner Brewery, which is an interesting place. It's gone now. One place that I, in particular, was impressed with or fascinated by was the Casablanca Lounge, which was right across the street from us here. It's rumored to be a mob-owned joint. It was run by a gentleman by the name of Bobby Clark, and it was here for many, many years. And it too had home to many famous jazz musicians, comedians. Richard Pryor was there, other people were there, and very little information remains about it. So we want to memorialize these kinds of places. Our institution right here at the Oak Hill Collaborative, on the corner of Ridge and Oak Hill, was an ice house. It was built into the side of the hill. This was Ridge Avenue, so it was a big ridge, and you go in and bring ice up from Mill Creek Park, put it in the basement here, and actually this was a one floor. There wasn't even the second floor where we are now, so they would just go into this, 24-inch, 36-inch granulated concrete block walls, and they would keep the ice there for as long as they could. This Oak Hill Avenue was a major thoroughfare. Market Street wasn't even built. The bridge wasn't even built until 1898 or 1899. So most of the traffic that went to the south side came up Oak Hill, or what was called Mill Street at the time. And so this was, kind of a natural place for commerce, things like ice houses and mills and grain storage and all of that, because this was kind of a farming area. So it grew into the Youngstown Community Action Council was here. They operated the Clarence Robertson Center and the McGuffey Center back in the 60s. They started in the 60s with the, a lot of affirmative action and Great American Society money was put into the inner cities after the riots of 68. It became, after it was the Youngstown Community Action Council, their finance director was a fellow by the name of Jim Trafficant, who then became head of the Mahoney County Drug Task Force and used this as a methadone clinic called Buddha. Many people remember that. Jim Trafficant, of course, went on to become sheriff, went on to become congressman, and was very notorious all over the country, but he kind of got his start here at the Oak Hill Collaborative. There are other institutes, many churches up along this street. Across the street was a soul saving station. It's a little small black church that's been there for many, many years. We have New Bethel Baptist Church, Mount Calvary great institution here on the south side. And there's others, the place where the Lord provides. And of course, St. Patrick's Church has been an institution here for over 100 years. That building was built back in 1912, I think, was the first parish. That church was built in 1917. So it's an anchor in the neighborhood. Oak Hill Collaborative came from St. Patrick's Church. My job up there was to acquire property. We have 2 acres of community gardens. We got a city playground. We have a parking lot. Oak Hill Collaborative owns a walking path up there. All things that we've done to improve the neighborhood. And again, that's how neighborhoods around here are going to be saved. You have to level the property that's there, that's deteriorating, and hopefully put something there that's clean and green, and people will at least have a pleasing view of it rather than looking at an eyesore. Clarence Robertson Center, great institution. So many African Americans in the South Side have stories about that. They remember they had their first dance classes. They went to school there. They had tutors. They played games. They had all sorts of cultural things that went through that place. But eventually, they abandoned it, sold to a church, who then abandoned it as well. When we came on the scene about 7, 8 years ago, it was a mess. So we went door to door in the neighborhood, made sure the people in the neighborhood thought it was a good idea. And they did. When we went to tear down, it was one of my great acts of pride around here. I had over 70 people, 75 people march, down to Market Street and down to Chalmers Avenue, and then we all ended up going and we're singing I felt like we were on the bridge at Selma, and we pulled into the parking lot. We had 17 ministers say a quick prayer, kind of as a dedication or an undedication, because it started as a church, then it became a cultural institution, and then it was converted to a church again. So we wanted to make sure that we treated it with respect and dignity. We blessed it, and then we tore it down. And now it's a playground, or a park, really, just a green park owned by the Collaborative. We have 4 or 5 places here on Oak Hill Avenue, and that's part of our contribution to the neighborhood, is to try to organize it. Now we use our facility for block watches and other community groups. Anybody that's trying to do something is more than welcome to use our facility. And it does have historical value, just like these many other places here on the street.
Good afternoon, Mr. Sean Posey. Anthony Hake, Oak Hill Collaborative. So if you could, just introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Sean Posey. I'm a journalist, writer, regional historian. I'm the author of 3 books, basically a loose trilogy on the history of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley.
Incredible. And you recently released a book. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, it's called The Hidden History of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, and a lot of it is about early 19th century or early 20th century Youngstown history and the Mahoning Valley history, but a lot of our chapters are about more obscure places and events in the valley that a lot of people might not be familiar with.
Okay, awesome. Do you find that history in Youngstown often becomes lost? And if so, why?
Yes. You could do a hidden or lost history for a lot of different places, but in a place like Youngstown, I think it's extremely relevant because the area's lost so much population. A lot of historical neighborhoods have depopulated. So a lot of the people who would normally pass down history through the generations are gone. Or the places that they might remember or talk about, just the infrastructure is totally gone. So it makes it a lot easier for important historical events and places to slip through the cracks, really, and kind of get lost to time in a way.
All right, well, it sounds like you're in the right business. So One thing that I'm incredibly curious about is what motivated you to target Youngstown specifically?
Well, in graduate school, I was a history major, and because it was graduate school, we had to do a lot of primary research for my thesis, and also for several different classes where you just had to produce a research article. So what I would do, whether it be industrial history, I was studying a lot of industrial history, and more modern American urban history, I would just use Youngstown as an example, because what I found out was Youngstown in the Mahoning Valley was so many rich examples of trends in American history that it was almost perfect for whatever class I was writing for, and all the research materials were right here at hand.
Let's start with what your most recent book focuses on. Can you tell us how it's different from Lost Youngstown?
It's different in a few senses. One is that it's about the entire Mahoning Valley. So Lost Youngstown, the first book, was just about the geographical city of Youngstown, and that's about it. Hidden History encompasses Trumbull County, Mahoning County, Youngstown, and surrounding area. So the first chapter is about the Spanish flu in the Mahoning Valley. And that actually goes into Ohio history too, because I talk about a few other places in Ohio and what was going on in the whole state. Because Youngstown was one of the worst hit cities in the country, large cities. And Ohio was severely affected as well, especially places like Chillicothe, where they had a big outbreak at a military barracks.
Okay. Needless to say, I'm excited to get my hands on it whenever I can. So it's interesting that you talk a lot about lost history, because we've identified a couple of sites right in the Oak Hill neighborhood that we would consider lost history, simply because the Mahoning Valley Historical Society has very little records on these sites ever existing. And in addition to this, we can't find any records online, which blows our mind, because you would think everything's on the internet until it isn't. So one location that I'd like to bring attention to would be Reed's Arena. And could you tell us a little bit about Reed's Arena, starting with when it opened?
Reed's Arena probably opened in the early 1960s as the official title, Reed's Arena. That building was there for a very long time. It was a skating rink before that called Max. I don't know if it's called Max or just Max Skating Rink. And that probably, I'm not sure how far that goes back, but that building goes way, way back in time. So probably around 1962, 1963, Reed's Arena comes into being. So it goes from a roller skating rink, pretty much just or mostly used by the white community, to a roller skating rink with a black business owner serving a black clientele, but also at night, especially on the weekends, a music venue, part of like what they used to call the Chitlin Circuit. So I'm not really talking about local acts, I'm talking about the biggest national acts coming through, especially R&B acts, and playing there at night and on the evenings.
Could you list off a couple of the musicians?
Yeah, so Parliament Funkadelic, Marvin Gaye, Dionne Warwick, people of that stature. I mean, really, the biggest names.
So these are a lot of people that ended up at Reed's Arena because of the kind of crowd that Reed's Arena attracted. It was a mixed crowd, which
Right.
served to their benefit. Now, why did they perform at Reed's Arena and not other locations?
That's a good question. At the time, the early mid 1960s, urban renewal was going on in the city. There were a lot of venues that were disappearing, mostly because the neighborhoods they were in were being demolished. In 1965, the Elms Ballroom, which was on Elm Street, it's about where Kilcawley is today. So before Youngstown State branched out and kind of ate up that neighborhood there, the Elms Ballroom for decades served as a place where, on certain nights of the week anyway, black residents could go and hear music. And they also attracted a lot of black groups going all the way back to the swing era up until the rock and roll era. So everybody from Duke Ellington to James Brown. So in 1965, when the university, or the college, tore down the Elms Ballroom, that was a venue that was lost. So a lot of that business probably shifted over to Reed's Arena, because there was still a demand to hear that type of music, especially in the mid 60s. but when you lose a venue like that, you get another one.
Right, right. And if you could put your finger on it, what would you say Reed's Arena had in regards to historical impact? Why should it be remembered today?
I think it should be remembered because it wasn't just a notable music venue as far as the type of caliber of acts it attracted, but it was also an important place in the black community and in the lower South Side in general. So as I mentioned, it was a skating rink. It was a place where kids could go, especially during a time still where there was a lot of segregation, lingering segregation in the community, so where black youth could go. It was also a place where people could go to hear great music, and it was also served as a community center. So in the late 60s, early 70s, when the African Cultural Weekend started, which was kind of a yearly celebration of African culture, they would also sometimes host it there, host speakers there at Reed's Arena, and also other events for the black community, like African American beauty pageants and things like that. So it was kind of a catch-all business, music venue, and community venue.
Okay, so it's a lot like the glue that held the community together. It was kind of like the mortar that held the bricks together, in a sense.
Yeah, it was a place for anybody who lived in that area during that time period would definitely remember going to and being an important part of the cultural fabric of the lower South Side in the 1960s and early 1970s.
So it's very interesting that there's so much about Reed's Arena that almost went undocumented, yet it proved to be a important historical site in not just the Black Youngstown South Side community, but just in Youngstown history in general. Another site that is similarly lost to time would be the Casablanca Nightclub, which is where the Foursquare Gardens green spot is today. I just have some questions about the Casablanca Nightclub, and let's start with, when was it opened?
Probably around 1961, 1962, it had made, I think I found ads going back at least that far, probably when it made the transition. Would make sense from a historical standpoint, because by the early 60s, the lower South Side, which had a lot of redlining, was starting to transition into a primarily African-American neighborhood. So that would have made sense for business like that to come about during that time period.
Okay, okay. And the Casablanca Nightclub was also a part of this Chitlin Circuit. Interestingly enough, it's not on the Wikipedia page for Chitlin Circuit. So what generated that kind of hearsay? What made it the Chitlin Circuit?
I talked to a lot of people who had expressly told me that and had been to shows there, and talked a little bit about the Chitlin Circuit, kind of informal too. And once again, unfortunately, like a lot of things in Black history, not terribly well documented in a lot of areas. You could probably speak a lot more specifically about it in, say, like Cleveland or Detroit, someplace like that, but less so here. And there were definitely the type of acts that were Chitlin Circuit acts that came and played there. It was primarily an African-American club, and it was during a time where there were still clubs in the area that would not admit African-Americans to actually inside them as patrons, though they could play at various different places. So it would have been that type of place.
So it wasn't like being a part of the Chitlin Circuit was necessarily a badge of honor. It was more so, these are the kinds of people we allow for the time.
Yeah, I guess probably now maybe some people would say it was a badge of honor. I don't know how people thought about it at the time. It was just we talk about the Chitlin Circuit, you talk about just a series of venues where you could really see the best of Black music at that time period, during a time period where there was still segregation going on.
And whenever I bring up the Casablanca Nightclub, it seems to be during that era where if somebody knew about it, they have either passed away by today, or they're kind of tight-lipped about it, as in they want to talk about it but can't. Do you think there's a reason for that?
I did a number of years ago. I talked to a few people in detail about the Casablanca, older African Americans, some of whom might have passed away by now. And I think part of what you're talking about is a lot of, as we were mentioning earlier, a lot of African American history has not been covered or has been dismissed. And I think there's probably still a lingering hesitancy among some people to see a club that they might have enjoyed and think was an important place either slandered or misrepresented by, you know, an outsider.
Okay.
That would be my guess.
That's an astute guess. Now let's challenge that stigma by recounting some of the things that Casablanca was known for. Like Reed's Arena, it was a popular venue for artists. Do you know of a few of the artists that performed there?
Yeah, there were national acts and local acts. So local acts, people like a guy by the name of Stage, Harold Hardwick, I believe was his real name, who was a real noted organist, Hump Jones, a lot of names that people wouldn't recognize today unless you were of a certain age. You know, a lot of R&B and the best R&B and jazz musicians in the area would have played at the Casablanca, but also groups like the OJs, Wilson Pickett played there. Aretha Franklin sang there in 1963 when she was still kind of primarily known as a jazz singer before she had made that transition. So yeah, that was also a place where there was local talent, and then, you know, some of the best national talent around also had come and played there as well.
All right. And can you speak a little bit to what happened to the Casablanca? Because when we go looking for it today, all we see now is a four-square block watch sign and a lot of green space. If it's such a popular nightclub, how did it meet its end?
Well, you know, of course, 1977 Black Monday, right? So the mills started closing in the late 70s and early 80s, and the closings of the mills had all kinds of economic repercussions that most people are aware of. But one thing that happened was that the lower South Side really depopulated, and a lot of the cornerstone businesses closed. And a lot of the buildings were torn down or burned down. The Casablanca transitioned to another club, I'm going to say about 1982 or 1983. I don't know if, I'm pretty sure that ownership switched hands, but it definitely became a different club during that time period. And that lingered on to the 1990s, and I believe it was torn down in 2007. In fact, I found out about the Casablanca when I was reading an article in the Columbus Dispatch, I believe it is, and it was an article about Youngstown, and they were actually interviewing a guy in front of the demolished ruins of the Casablanca, and he had mentioned, you know, this used to be a really big nightclub, and here's the acts I saw here, and I had never heard of it myself, and I was kind of astonished that a place like that had been on Oak Hill. I didn't know that, you know, there were any clubs over there, so that was actually what led me into investigating the history of it, just this little snippet that I saw in an article in the Columbus newspaper.
And it's funny how not just one, but two major venues brought such big names in music, R&B and jazz specifically. So when you stumble upon a relic like that, you almost become shocked that you don't have more information about this, shocked that you haven't found something about this already, that finding out about it when it's demolished, it almost feels like you're too late. And so that is part of the reason why we want to record this, is to kind of capture that snapshot in time before it's too late. So any final comments, Mr. Posey?
Yeah, you know, I would, as somebody who has done research on quote unquote lost places in the Youngstown area, and especially African American cultural touchstones, there's a real dearth of information. It's very difficult to find out information. A lot of places are, as you've mentioned, almost lost to time. A lot of the people who remember them are gone, they're dispersed, or they've passed away. So it's a difficult area to research, but it's important because, as we've talked about here, there are so many iconic cultural places in Youngstown that fall into that category that deserve to be remembered.
All right, and thank you for your time, Mr. Sean Posey.
Hey, thanks.
And for those of you watching, please check out his book, Hidden History of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley. If you can't see the cover, there's the title. Mr. Sean Posey, thank you for sitting down and having this talk with us.
Thank you.
Clarence Robertson Center has a rich cultural value in what it brought to the community. Clarence Robertson Center provided a space where people could belong and be themselves. It's a shame not seeing these spaces around today. Clarence Robertson Center was described as the glue of the community by the Youngstown Vindicator. Named after the man who broke the color barrier for Youngstown's Parks and Recreation Board in 1939. Prior to his great deeds of black rights activism, the building was simply known as the South Side Neighborhood Center. It served many roles, from being a health clinic site, a daycare, voter registration, and often the platform for vital talks and films on social issues. Unfortunately, the neighborhood fell into various levels of disinvestment and disrepair, taking the building down with it in the 1990s. It stood as a dilapidated structure until around 2015 when Oak Hill Collaborative led a coalition to bring the structure down and in its place put a green space. When talking about historical sites on the South Side, there are none as interesting or magnificent as the St. Patrick's Catholic Church. The church was originally built in 1911 and cultivated a healthy parish under the lead of Reverend Monsignor Charles A. Martin. In 1923, St. Patrick's Church broke ground for a new building. Having realized they outgrew their current building, it was 3 years later in 1926 that the new cathedral was opened and put the finishing touches on the magnificent Gothic architecture we see today. Prior to this new building, however, was yet another shard of often forgotten history, the Youngstown Patricians.
Afternoon, Mr. Crawford. Thank you for meeting with me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's talk about the Youngstown Patricians.
My name is Bill Crawford. I'm the historian for St. Patrick's Church. The Youngstown Patricians formed in January 29th was their first meeting in 1912. They were a club that was basically for the moral and social and physical well-being of its members. And they were under the direction of our pastor, Father Martin, and that it was not only a club, it was to do a lot of social events. They had parties, they had picnics to help fund the church and raise money and make it a cohesive group. The first meeting actually drew like over 300 men. If you look when the football team started, they came from maybe a radius of 20 or 25 miles, in reading about how they organized, and that was one of the things that they mentioned. But it was basically a lot from the South Side. They had a real good relationship because this was a new territory, new church, and it used to be before our church was open. They opened the Market Street Bridge in 1899, which then, instead of all of our parishioners that were going over to St. Columbus, now they had their own parish. And they all worked together as like a unit. It was amazing if you just read about it. I think their impact on history, particularly in this area, was important to remember, because they started out as a parish, and with the organization of the club, there was all kind of different organizations throughout the church, women's auxiliary and altar guild and everything. But I think it should be remembered for just a parish coming together, working as one, and basically it. Well, the parish started a football team in 1914. They got together with basically 18 players, and they played locally. They played like Akron, maybe Ellsworth, different teams. They had a 8-game schedule. They won 7, lost 1 to Salem. Then Father and the organization decided, let's get into more football and better programs and different caliber of teams, which they started the next year in 1915. And I think that the idea was just to compete. They give the parishioners that wanted to be affiliated with sports, an opportunity to play. You would play, we played all our games in right field, and they would charge fans like to go in 10 cents, 25, but they increased it as the years went by. And they would pay the players so much money to play. But you can switch next week, play another team. There was no contracts back then. So you can play with other teams. And this is where we did so good in that championship in 1915. Then the next year in 1916 started off great. But then they had a tougher schedule. And then, boom, their world championship, so to speak, went out the window. 1917, they finished 7-4, like in 16. 17, they started, that's where the great Jim Thorpe played for the Canton Bulldogs. And they came down, and, they beat Youngstown. They said there were 7,000 people, to watch the game. 3-0. We missed 3 field goals, of course, in the game. And then it ended up where they beat us later in the year. Massillon beat us, so they were so-so. And then that was 17 and 18, no football, World War I. And then in 19, we started up again, a couple of games, then they stopped. Then they had some games the NFL then started in 1920. And supposedly we were offered a contract to go to be an NFL team in 1922. But everything fell through. They never could put anything together to really produce a team. But you probably more than you wanted to know.
Football aside, St. Patrick's has other reasons to be remembered as well. For example, in 1922, Reverend Edward A. Mooney was the appointed pastor of St. Patrick's Church for about 3 months. He then moved on to become the spiritual director for the North American College in Rome, Italy. Following this, he was then named the Archbishop of the Detroit Archdiocese and then elevated to Cardinal. It is this very pastor that the local high school, Cardinal Mooney High, is named after. In 1954, St. Patrick's Church was also used as a temporary cathedral when the St. Columbia Cathedral was burned down in 1954. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Monsignor P. Breen Malone was the appointed pastor at the time. Father Monsignor set the tone for the church as very progressive, especially on various matters such as war, whereas many other churches in the area were more conservative. St. Patrick's also has been described as the anchor holding the community down in times of change, giving them the place to collaborate and work on projects to further benefit the community. For example, In collaboration with organizations such as the Oak Hill Collaborative, St. Patrick's Church acquired and demolished 25 to 30 derelict properties on the south side of Youngstown. While unfortunate to see these properties and their history go away, people in the neighborhood say that they feel safer, their lives feel cleaner, and that the crime went down immensely. It still operates today. After 111 years and since its founding, it's been home to 10 pastors. Current pastor is Father Kevin Peters, former St. Patrick's parishioner and South Side resident. To learn more about the vast history of the Hope in the heart of the city, all are free to stop by and acquire the vibrant parish of St. Patrick's Church. Our goal with this originally was to provide a tour of the Oak Hill neighborhood on the south side of Youngstown. We hope that is exactly what you found here. Thank you all for joining us on this journey through time. From the old to the new, we'd like to thank everyone who was able to contribute to this project. And we give a special thanks to the Wean Foundation for funding it. To see what else we are up to, be sure to check out oakhillcollaborative.org to learn more about our current programming and more projects like this video. Until next time, this has been Denzel Stevens at the Oak Hill Collaborative, and thank you for watching. Take care.